Thank you for the opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk to you about my research in the Strano Laboratory. So I'm a graduate student in the Department of Chemical Engineering here at MIT. Today I want to share my work on thermal power wave and asymmetric chemical doping, two different energy concepts in the context of powering microscale energy generation. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge my thesis advisor, Michael Strano, as well as the people who have contributed greatly to the work that you're about to hear today. So for the past few years, I got immersed into this area of trying to think about how to power microsystems in the human vesicles. And this is a famous picture now that is several decades back on this concept of shrinking down a submarine into the size of a red blood cell and have it flow in the human vasculature, of course, for medical purposes. And people around the world and scientifically have been enthusiastic about the concept of making a microscale systems, in the nanorobotics world or molecular electronics, molecular machines, and synthetic biology. People all around the world are interested in making tiny systems that can do some sort of function inside the human body. And of course, if you want truly modular and reconfigurable capabilities out of these microsystems, then you probably want to really think about how to shrink down a macro scale robotics and to be able to make something at the length scale of a tiny red blood cell. But then there's a lot of challenges here. This is just a snapshot of decades of research on sort of shrinking down robotic systems to the micro scale. And as you can see, we're nowhere close to there yet. And of course, we are interested in making, for lack of a better word, we just call it colloidal state machines, which are electronic machines that can really power itself autonomously at this kind of cellular length scale. And the colloidal name comes from the fact that it's really less than 10 microns. So it is colloidally stable in the solution. So imagine you're shrinking down a computer into a particle that is colloidally stable. And I don't have to reiterate on, of course, the significance in medical or environmental monitoring or chemical engineering scenarios where you can put these tiny robotic systems into microfluidic chambers and being able to inspect the relative concentrations of different chemicals at different temperatures. And you can even imagine injecting the system into the crevices of the earth and be able to do some sort of geological exploration work. But if we just snap back to reality here, this is sort of where our current autonomous electronic systems are standing today, right? With our computers and personal laptops and sort of cell phones that are really tens of centimeters in size. But these systems are really powerful. I mean, they're fully reconfigurable, they're totally autonomous, and people are making effort shrinking these systems down to do the kind of task we're hoping to achieve. And so Tim Liu here at MIT has led some effort on these ingestible electronics that are really still maybe slightly larger than a centimeter, which is why they are limited in the human digestive tract instead of getting smaller into what we really want, which is the blood vessel. And of course, if you don't want your electronics to be clogged up in the blood vessel, you probably want to make them smaller or similar to the size of a red blood cell. And our lab has made some effort in this regard of constructing fully functionalized electronic systems that can function autonomously inside a solution. But that's not the focus of the talk today. Today, I want to talk about energy and how to power these systems sort of on a micro scale. So thinking about, again, on our objective here, we're trying to power a system that is maximally 10 by 10 by 10 micron cube, which if my arithmetic is right, it's about 1 picoliter. How do you power a system untethered in solution with 1 picoliter of volume? That's the big question here. And of course, you can think about storage ideas, lithium-ion battery, supercapacitor, which if you just do some back of the envelope calculation, you can quickly see that even with the best lithium-ion battery today, you can probably power the system at the best estimate, about a couple hundred seconds with a picoliter of volume at 1 nanowatt. On the other hand, if you think about harvesting from the environment, then you suddenly don't have to think about the energy constraint because you're technically immersed in this infinite energetic bath. But you still have to worry about power output, right? So again, if you look at this magical 1 nanowatt of power output, right off the bat, you can just see that only radio frequency harvesting and photovoltaic can step on the right-hand side or the larger side of this 1 nanowatt regime. With radio frequency and an antenna that is the size of 100 micron or less, you can typically power this stuff with enormous power from about 1 millimeter away. And that is just not enough for some of the applications we're thinking. Photovoltaic is good. Although I would add that if you want to power your system inside the blood vessel, you don't have a lot of sunlight or visible light there. I've never been there myself, but I'd imagine inside my blood vessel is about pitch black. So clearly, then you have to think outside of the box and maybe think about harvesting energy or storing energy maybe with some other way. And this is where we step in with our research. So here's a photo that I really liked. Can someone tell me what it is? Or do you have an idea what it is? Yeah, so it's a hen. Well, this is actually a photo taken in Puerto Rico. So this is bioluminescence. So this is where when you put your hand in the water and there's mechanical stimulus, this organism right here, which is sort of a phytoplankton, will light up itself. So this is a chemical reaction generating light, of course, in response to mechanical stress. The basic chemistry is that you turn ATP into AMP, turn luciferin at the concentration of oxygen to oxyluciferin and generate 1 photon of light. How do microorganisms generate energy, right? If you look at their mitochondria, across the membrane, the fundamental generation of ATP from AMP or ADP is by the driving force of a gradient in proton concentration. You need a gradient of some sort if you want to generate energy, right? You can think about heat engine. You would have a hot temperature, cold temperature. That's a temperature gradient. Or you can think about the action potential of a neuron. You need the sodium-potassium differences across the membrane in order to generate the electrical signal. So gradients generate energy. How do we get gradient? And so as previously alluded to, we use carbon nanotubes in our lab. And one of the fascinating things about carbon nanotube, which, by the way, you can think of them as rolled up sheets of graphene. If you think about that way, you generate carbon nanotubes of different chirality, depends on how you rolled up your sheets of graphene, and you get different sort of electronic structure, this tunable band gap, which is nice because this is the model compound that we can use to test some of our theory and to probe the generation mechanism of the microscale electricity generation concepts that we have. The way to create a chemical potential gradient is through chemical doping. And so this works the same with carbon nanotube, with silicon, with MOS2, any other semiconductive material. In order to generate this gradient, though, you have to tap in some sort of external stimuli. So people have thought about light to make photovoltaic p-n junctions like this. Mechanical strain can also generate a chemical potential gradient. But today we'll focus on temperature bias and chemical absorption as the external stimuli that we're going to use to generate this gradient, which we're then using to harvest electronic energy. Specifically, we're talking about thermal power wave and asymmetric chemical doping. So thermal power wave, this is a crash course on thermal power wave. This is something also invented almost 10 years ago now back here at MIT. This is a very much slowed down video. So this is a very fast burning reaction wave on top of a carbon nanotube fiber. So you load up your carbon nanotube fiber with solid chemical fuel with very, very high delta H of combustion. And you launch this reaction wave, generate really high temperature as well as some voltage at really high power. That's the key. If you do the analysis right, there will be 2 sources of this energy. The open circuit voltage has 2 components. One is from the thermal electricity you just naturally get by burning something, right? So you have hot temperature here, cold temperature here. That temperature gradient is going to generate voltage. So that's the conventional thermal electricity. But then you quickly realize the story doesn't end there. There's an excess source of energy, which is this what we call a chemical potential gradient, which if you look at this schematic, this is the carbon nanotube bundle. And as the reaction wave launches, you're naturally going to burn out the chemical that is doped on the left-hand side of the carbon nanotube. So you get this gradient in Fermi energy, which also has the capability to draw power. Knowing this theory, then the question we ask is that whether you can increase this energy output by tuning the chemical potential gradient specifically. So we moved for example, from the canonical chemical fuel that we have been using, which is nitrocellulose, to another chemical fuel, sodium azide. In this case, sodium azide, you can measure that is N-doping the carbon nanotube, whereas nitrocellulose is P-doping it. And by simply switching this fuel, we were able to show that you can bump up the energy efficiency of the whole thermal power wave process by 100 times, which is the first time we ever used the thermal power wave to actually make a device that can light up an LED. Now, at this point, people will ask, I motivated the whole thing by saying we want to power electronic system in solution, and you're certainly not going to be burning anything inside the solution. But the lesson that we learned here, that is you can use different chemicals to tune the electronic structure and the Fermi energy gradient in order to generate this flow of electron that can be used to harvest electricity. Asymmetric chemical doping is something that we're trying to leverage the chemical potential gradient without using a burning reaction wave. Instead of using a burning reaction wave that deplete the chemical dopant on top of a carbon nanotube, you can actively add the dopant towards a carbon nanotube in the form of a really fast absorbing liquid. So here, if you put your liquid acceptor, electron acceptor here, you're going to very fast lower the Fermi energy on the left, and this gradient here can draw electrons. If you prefer an energy diagram, the acceptor lowest unoccupied molecular orbital, or LUMO level, can be used as the acceptor level, and you can draw electron from the donor carbon nanotube. And this way you can create an electric field here to drive electricity flow. And experimentally, this is actually very easily done. So you can just drop a very tiny amount of this liquid dopant on top of a sheet of carbon nanotube fiber, and you can generate voltage as high as 1 volt, positive or negative depending on where you drop the chemical dopant. So this is asymmetric chemical doping in a nutshell. But if you think about the process, it literally is this liquid molecule diffusing and then absorbing onto the surface of a carbon nanotube. And then subsequently, there's a partial electron transfer process that has to take place in order to generate this voltage. So it can be either transport controlled or electron transfer control. So we ruled out the possibility of transport control by doing the same exercise using 27 other small molecular dopant. And if you plot the voltage that is generated, or the rate of voltage generation, by the way, as a function of the molecular size, you see no trend here. We initially thought this is going to be a transport control process, but we see no trend of voltage as a function of molecular size. So could it be that this is an electron transfer control process? And if that's the case, we resort back to Marcus electron transfer theory. And basically, you can derive the following equation, saying that electron transfer rate has something to do with both the reorganization energy, that is the energy it takes for the solvent to reorganize themselves around your donor carbon nanotube, as well as this thermodynamic energy difference between the LUMO, which is the acceptor band level, and the donor level, which is the SWINT valence band level. So if you plot the same data that I just showed you that shows no trend as a function of the LUMO across these all different 27 molecules that you have used, you see a beautiful sort of inverted volcano shape. So this is the same data that you just saw on the last slide, but organized then as a function of the molecular orbital energy level of the acceptor molecule. And you basically see this whole thing. And this, of course, is the solvent that corresponds to the best delta G of the electron transfer, according to the Marcus theory. And the dotted line here shows a fit. Understanding the mechanism of how electricity is being generated using asymmetric chemical doping, we're able to then prolong the longevity of the generation process. It's highly reversible. Also, you can do this for a variety of different solvents. It doesn't have to be limited to just acetonitrile or any organic solvent. But also, you can tune the carbon nanotube in order to keep increasing the voltage output. And then you can also make the device smaller and smaller. What is interesting here is that because the impedance gets smaller and smaller, we actually do make more maximum power that you can get from this process. With that, I'll just say asymmetric chemical doping is an interesting phenomena that we can probably start to think about how to implement and engineer it onto a colloidal particle form factor. It shows potential of this power scaling. And I'd like to just end here and welcome any questions if I still have time. Thank you. Yeah, so the voltage will basically go very slightly negative, but then the drying process takes more time. So like it's a very leveled off process. Yep. Yeah, so this whole process, this whole cycle can be done, let's say, depending on the boiling point of the solvent that you use, of course. But then with the canonical acetonitrile, we're getting about 50 seconds. So it takes about 50 seconds for that droplet to dry, and then you can drop another, it will generate the same voltage.
At some point, you probably have enough solid.
So it's just carbon nanotube. Yeah, it's just acetonitrile. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks.